Hi everyone, welcome to this PowerPoint on aquatic biomes where we are going to look a little bit more in depth at all of the different aquatic biomes. We're still in the same learning objectives on aquatic biomes as the overview PowerPoint. And we're also going to be looking at some other learning objectives that are in units that we'll talk about second semester but fit in really well here. For the one on the left, it's really just focusing in on this coral reef section, but then the entire thing on the right on the impacts of wetlands and mangroves. Here's the vocab. And this slide is just copied and pasted from the previous PowerPoint, but I wanted to refresh you with this, that these biomes that we're going to talk about are going to be different from one another based off of salinity, temperature, sunlight, the turbidity, depth, all of those different things. Keep those in mind even if we don't specifically address them in each of these, in each of the biomes moving forward. And I've also copied and pasted this slide where we're separating out the biomes between the marine biomes and the freshwater biomes. All the marine biomes are going to be about 3 to 3.5% salt unless otherwise indicated, and the freshwater biomes are going to be less than 1% salt unless otherwise indicated. And just like with the terrestrial biomes, you guys do need to know the net primary productivity for each of the marine biomes in relative terms. Know which ones are more or less productive, which ones are the most. So like, for example, coral reefs are among the most productive biomes in the world. And we'll talk about some of these notable examples as we move forward. And here I thought that we would have it maybe a better outline of the marine and freshwater and brackish biomes, just so that you guys can have an outline of where we're going. And we'll finally get into it with our first biome. We're starting in the oceans, then we'll move to the brackish and freshwater biomes. And we're going to start right along the shoreline with the intertidal zone. This is the area along the shore that is below water level during high tide, but above water level at low tide. What are the tides? Well, the tides are predictable rises and falls of the water, happens about twice a day, where the water will experience a high tide and then a low tide, each twice a day. And that's due to the gravitational pull of the moon, of the sun, and centrifugal force of the earth. I cannot say that word. This is like the fourth take, and I'm still trying to say that word. All right. Basically, really long period waves. When the moon is directly overhead, we tend to have a high tide. When the moon is at more of a right angle to that location, we tend to have a low tide, but it's definitely more complex than that. But we don't need to go into all the intricacies of the details. Depending on the location and the relative position of the sun and the moon with the earth and each other, we can have some very extreme high and low tides. And you can see some of that in these pictures on this slide. So you can imagine in the intertidal zone that conditions are going to change a lot throughout the day from the tides rising and falling. The temperature obviously will depend on the latitude. Some place at the equator is going to be consistently warm, whereas some place in the poles might be consistently cool, but sometimes very frigidly cold. But in general, when you have a tide pool, which is a shallow basin that is left filled with water when the tide recedes, so this is like a bowl that you're seeing in the bottom right-hand corner that is carved into the rock, and it's holding water as the rest of the ocean recedes and the tide goes down. That pool is just going to be sitting under the sun all day, and it's going to increase in temperature over the course of that day. And as that water evaporates from that pool, the salinity is going to increase. So organisms have to be adapted for that. The nutrient levels tend to be relatively high because we're along the coast and we have a lot of influx of nutrients from the land. And the dissolved oxygen is usually very high because, or at least pretty high, because we have a lot of wave action, and the waves as they crash along the shore are going to become aerated. They're going to allow a lot of oxygen to dissolve into that water. In the intertidal zone, we tend to have a subdivision of zones. Just above the intertidal, we have the splash zone. And you might have organisms there that are very well adapted for life in air, but they need the water that splashes on them all the time, or at least during high tide, to keep them moist. So something like a limpet might be growing above the high tide line, but it's getting splashed by the waves, and that's keeping it moist and keeping it alive, and they're doing just fine. That's where they're adapted. In the high tide zone, you start to get barnacles as well, and that's when we're in the intertidal. Some barnacles and some other organisms that are adapted for being some submerged during some portions of the day and then exposed to the air at other portions. During the mid-tide zone, you see that we get even more and different organisms. And then in the low tide zone, lots of different organisms. And these are the organisms that are adapted to be completely submerged pretty much all the time. Occasionally they'll be exposed in a like a neap tide or a spring tide or whatever, but they will usually be underwater. So that's where you're going to see stuff like fish, kelp, corals, and sea stars, or some sea stars, most sea stars. Okay, so the point of this slide is that different organisms are adapted to these different zones, and you see a lot of biodiversity in the intertidal zone because of that, because you have different organisms that have niche partitioned to be in different areas of this of 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 the rocky shoreline. And as I said on the previous slide, species do have to be adapted for a wide range of environmental conditions, regardless of where they're at in that intertidal zone. If they're in the high tide zone, the splash zone, or the low tide zone, they have to be adapted for a wide range of conditions, but they do tend to form distinct bands up a rocky shoreline or in tide pools where they are suited best. Now I tried to get a map for every one of these biomes. The intertidal zone, everywhere where you see a shoreline. So wherever there's a shoreline, there's an intertidal zone, and that could be from a sandy beach to a rocky cliff. It doesn't really matter what type of shoreline it is, as long as there's a shoreline, that's where the intertidal zone is going to be. They occur around the world, every single continent, every single shoreline. The net primary productivity is going to vary a lot. That's going to vary based off of latitude. So something at the poles may be less productive than something at the equator. It's going to be vary based off of the type of intertidal zone. So a sandy beach is going to be way less productive than a rocky shoreline with tons of tide pools and lots of algae growing on them. It's going to depend on the ocean currents, whether there's a nearby river or not, whether there is influx of nutrients from the land. All kinds of different things are going to allow the net primary productivity to vary, but on general, it tends to be one of the more productive areas in the ocean because the intertidal zone is exposed to sunlight. So you can have algae at the base of the food chain, kicking off that food chain and providing at the base of the food chain for a very complex food web. In general, because net primary productivity tends to be pretty high, so does species richness. Now, again, sandy beaches tend to be less species rich. You guys have been to a beach probably, and some beaches almost feel like deserts. There's no, I mean, it's covered in sand, but more importantly for this, there's very little life on some beaches. Now, on other beaches, there's quite a bit of life, and a lot of that life is occurring when the water is at high tide. You have stuff like hermit crabs and worms in the sand. You have lots of birds going down to the shoreline to find those invertebrates that are hiding in the sand. So not all beaches, but beaches tend to have less biodiversity than a rocky shoreline, is what I'm saying. You're going to have lots of marine invertebrates in the intertidal zone, lots of fish that move up and down with the tide, marine mammals, including seals and sea lions, sea otters, as well as lots of birds, lots of shorebirds in the intertidal zone. So biodiversity is pretty high, and you have that confluence between the land and the ocean. Some of the ecosystem services include food, recreation. These are the location of all of our docks, our wharfs, our piers, and our harbors, and it's where we often build towns and cities just off of the intertidal zone. Obviously, we don't build our cities in the intertidal zone, but that's where the docks are. That's where the piers are. So a lot of them have been developed, at least around major cities. Sometimes the intertidal zone can protect us from storm surges, so something like a barrier island or a sandbar can protect from storm surges, coastal stabilization, and again, it really depends on how well protected that area is, or how protected from development rather that area is. Some place that is very harsh is not going to be developed as much as some place that's very accessible. And then some places kind of find a happy median between keeping a lot of the natural landscape and development. So some threats and solutions. Development is a huge one, especially building those harbors, especially for expanding them for large ships that are deep bottomed. Stuff like the fuel tankers and the cargo ships that are transporting goods across oceans need a very large harbor to dock in. Protections can include restricting development, parks and preserves, marine preserves. Dredging is a huge issue. So this is an example of dredging up here. Basically, what they're doing is they are removing the sediment from underneath of the ship and then spitting it out over this direction. And that's to deepen this area, or it could be to build up this sandy area, one of the two of those. Okay, but dredging is removing sediment and often transporting it somewhere else. And that is a huge issue because it disturbs that sediment where a lot of organisms live, all those benthic organisms. We tend to clear coastal wetlands, salt marshes, mangrove forests. We have coastal erosion, as well as sea level rise is shifting the intertidal zone up. Okay, and once we leave the intertidal zone, we start to move into the open ocean. The open ocean is the largest biome on the planet in both terms of surface area and volume. It covers about 2/3 of the Earth's surface, and it's everywhere where we see blue in this map on the bottom right. It is one of the least productive biomes per unit area on the planet. So per square meter or per cubic meter, it is one of the least productive biomes. However, because it covers so much of the planet and because it's so deep, it is in total one of the most productive. It is in total like very, very, very productive. Okay, so think about it this way. If you have a dollar versus 1,000 pennies, all those tiny little pennies add up. In this case, all of those tiny little square meters add up. And I would rather have 1,000 pennies than $1, if you know what I mean, right? $10 versus $1. So in total, the open ocean is very productive. The net primary productivity per square meter is very low, but each one of those tiny little square meters adds up to be a whole lot. If we're looking at some of the physical features, obviously temperature is going to vary depending on latitude. It's going to vary based off of depth. But one thing that is relatively consistent but still varies all around the world is pH. And the pH has been decreasing, like we talked about with the carbon cycle, the pH has been decreasing. Right now it is about 8.1. It was about 8.3 before the Industrial Revolution. So even though that doesn't look like a lot because the pH scale is logarithmic, that represents about a 30% change in acidity, a 30% increase in acidity. Obviously, there's very high biodiversity in the open ocean, and connecting back to that net primary productivity, there's lots and lots of photosynthesis occurring in the oceans. The oceans are responsible for half of the oxygen in the atmosphere, meaning that 1 out of every 2 breaths that you breathe was provided by the ocean. So to illustrate that net primary productivity graphically, I have highlighted or put a square around the open ocean or a rectangle around the open ocean. Again, the net primary productivity is comparable to the tundra and the deserts and barely higher than rock, sand, and ice per square meter. However, because it occupies over 10 times more surface area than any other biome, it produces a whole lot of productivity, a whole lot of photosynthesis. Okay, so notice this right here, how we break from 6 to 65, and I'm combining the ocean neritic zone in this. So this you can even add to that, right? So very productive, extremely productive environment, not only because of its surface area, but also the depth. Now this slide is also copied and pasted from the previous PowerPoint. I do not expect you guys to memorize all of these. You don't need to memorize epipelagic, mesopelagic, bathypelagic, abyssopelagic, or hydropelagic. Don't worry about them. We will talk about the benthic zone separately, so we will discuss that. But these other terms, be familiar with them. If you read them, know in general what they mean, but you don't have to memorize them. And you definitely don't have to memorize the depths. One thing that I do want you to notice though is that the ocean, once you get out of the photic zone and down into the bathypelagic and abyssal pelagic, it is very, very, very cold. Okay, just above freezing. One thing that is important though is the biological carbon pump. In the oceans, as we've talked about, we have the air-sea gas exchange where CO2 dissolves into the ocean water and then escapes the ocean water back into the atmosphere in a more or less equal and opposite um, manner, except for today, as we're adding more CO2 into the atmosphere and more of it is dissolving into the ocean and forming carbonic acid. But that's not what we're talking about here. Here, we're talking about how carbon gets from the atmosphere, dissolves into the ocean, is incorporated into organic molecules through photosynthesis, and then moving up the food chain or just by those producers sinks down to the bottom of the ocean and gets trapped in the sediment. That is the biological carbon pump. It is how we pump carbon from the atmosphere down into the sediment at the bottom of the ocean. So what's going on? Basically what's going on is that you have carbon dioxide dissolving into the ocean water, and it's being used by the photosynthesizers, the phytoplankton and the algae that are in the photic zone, the topmost zone where light can penetrate in the ocean. They can die. So something like this coccolithophore, for example, is one of those photosynthesizers. Those little guys can die and they can take that carbon in their living tissues, or in the case of this coccolithophore, the carbon that's in the calcium carbonate discs that's protecting its little single cell body down to the bottom of the ocean floor if they settle down as marine snow. Okay, so it's taking atmospheric carbon and locking in organic molecules, and then either going through the food chain and everything dies, and some of that settles down to the ocean floor. Notice how this almost like looks like a funnel because less and less and less gets down to the very bottom. Or the photosynthesizers themselves take that carbon once they die all the way down to the bottom of the ocean where it is stored in those reactive sediments. This shouldn't be anything new. We talked about this with the carbon cycle. I'm just putting a name to it right now. Okay, the biological carbon pump. So some ecosystem services that I haven't mentioned yet, ones that I have mentioned can be stuff like carbon sequestration, and which is up there, but also the formation of oxygen that we breathe. But some other services include fisheries, transport, especially for goods, but less so for people, but also for people. Like, people taking a cruise or something like that. In the past, transporting people, like people going transporting people probably is the wrong way to say that because that sounds bad, but taking a ship if you're to travel from North America to Europe, like the Titanic, people moving. Um, Nutrients and water cycling, carbon sequestration, habitat, cultural services, etc. Some of the threats include overfishing and bycatch, aquatic pollution, and habitat destruction. And we'll talk about those in the ocean kind of ad nauseum, in part in this PowerPoint, but mostly moving forward throughout the semester, as well as overfishing. We're going to spend an entire couple days on that. The benthos is at the bottom of the ocean and every other single body of water. Every body of water has a bottom to it, and that bottom is the benthic zone. The benthos is the community that occurs at the benthic zone. So this describes any of the species that live on, attached to, or in the sediment. So the benthos is extremely variable. It could be fresh or salt water, depending on if you're talking about the bottom of a lake or the bottom of the ocean. The depth varies whether you're talking about a lake that is, 10 meters deep or a pond that is a meter deep versus the deepest part of the ocean, like the Challenger Deep in the Marianas Trench, right? So it's going to be everything's going to vary so much based off of where you're at, which benthic zone you're looking at. And I have that represented here. The light's going to vary. Some places are pitch black dark. Other places, like a shallow lake, you're going to have so much light hitting the bottom of that lake that you can do photosynthesis. But since we're talking about the ocean, let's stick with the ocean, and that depth is usually going to be pretty deep. The nutrients also range widely. Again, if you have a eutrophic lake versus the bottom of the ocean, going to be very different amounts of nutrients. In the ocean, nutrients primarily fall as marine snow. Now, I didn't specifically define marine snow a couple slides ago, but you saw it on the slide with the biological carbon pump. And those dead organisms, as they float down the ocean, the water column in the ocean, are called marine snow. Okay, it's really kind of gross and it sounds really pleasant, but it's kind of gross because it's all the fish waste and all the dead bits of fish and like dead algae, phytoplankton, dead zooplankton. If you have a shark that catches a fish and tears it apart, and some of those little tiny specks of flesh settle down to through the ocean. That's all marine snow. Okay. Some larger sources of nutrients could include whale falls, and that can support a very diverse community in a very small localized area very temporarily. All right. Dissolved oxygen is also going to vary depending on what type of benthic zone you're looking at and what type of body of water and all of those things with the depth. And net primary productivity is going to vary based on everything above. So most variable biome I think that we're going to talk about. The benthos again is the community of organisms that lives on, near, or in the sediment on in whatever body of water we're looking at. That could be stuff like flatfish, like the halibut that you see in the bottom right. It could be clams and mussels and sponges, like what we see on the top right. Or it could be many of these organisms diagrammed down here, many of the worms that are living in the sediment. Um, so lots of different variability. You've seen stuff like even like corals can be considered benthic organisms because they could be attached to the bottom. It could be like skates and rays, lots of different organisms like lobsters and crabs that all live on the bottom. So there's a lot of ecosystem services, especially for food, so fishing and either for fish or shellfish, habitat, biodiversity, and we have that carbon that's sequestered in the sediment that tends to dissolve either very slow, or sorry, decompose very slowly or not at all. So it can be a very large carbon reservoir. The threats vary again based off of where we're looking at, but it could be anything from dredging, like we see on the bottom right, where again they're sucking up the sediment in one place and then shooting it off into another. Um, whether that's to deepen a harbor or to like build up a section of the harbor to break down to stop storm surges, whatever reason it is that they dredge, and there's a lot of them. It could be shipping that can interfere with the benthos. It could be pollution, like this plastic bag from the Challenger Deep. I believe that's where it was, but it was definitely in the Mariana Trench. Overharvesting of wild foodstuffs, all of those different things. Our next marine biome is upwellings, which we talked about before in the context of El Nino and La Nina, so you guys should be relatively familiar with upwellings. Upwellings are areas where nutrient-rich deep water comes to the surface. If we were just talking about marine snow taking all those organic molecules from higher up in the water column down to the bottom, well, every once in a while around the planet in these specific locations, they can come up. And when they come up with these upwellings, they contain lots and lots of nutrients. That sediment and the deep cold water contains lots of nutrients, and that can get brought up and that can feed phytoplankton, or at least provide the nutrients for phytoplankton to do photosynthesis and be the base of the food chain. And then you can have very productive fisheries because of the large phytoplankton numbers. Okay, so you can have lots of small fish, lots of big fish, and then lots of fish for people to fish for. And that's what I have shown here in this sequence where we have these high nutrients that are upwelling, and let's say that it upwelled right off of the coast right there, and we can see the blooms of the phytoplankton Now, these are not harmful algal blooms like we've talked about. These are like normal, natural, desirable increases in phytoplankton number and nothing bad going on there. That increases the small fish population, which increases the big fish populations, or in the case that we see here with this humpback whale, whale populations. So upwellings, really brief. We talked about them before. Let's move on to hydrothermal vents. Hydrothermal vents are extremely unique ecosystems. These occur on the ocean floor, so we're back to the benthos, where there's tectonic activity, and that's almost always going to be at plate boundaries. Okay, basically what you have is that you have small cracks or deformations or faults in the Earth's crust down there at the bottom of the ocean, and that's allowing heat, minerals, some gases to escape from the mantle. It's not carrying lava, it's not carrying magma, it's mostly just minerals and, in some cases, superheated water and gases that are coming up. And it's going to create a really unique ecosystem where the primary producers are doing chemosynthesis, where they're taking raw minerals like hydrogen sulfide from this plume of this mineral plume, and they're doing chemosynthesis with it. It's way too deep for photosynthesis. These are pitch black, dark ecosystems that are at the bottom of the ocean where no light penetrates, and the only light in these photos is from the camera or from the remote operated vehicle that is producing that light and taking pictures. So the hydrothermal vents are very extreme environments. We have very high pressure because we're at extreme depth. The temperature gradients are extreme. It goes from very, very, very hot, like over 600 degrees Celsius at the mouth of the vent, to progressively colder the further away from the vent that you get until you hit 4 degrees Celsius or 2 degrees Celsius even at the bottom of the ocean. So you can go from something that is above the boiling point of water, and the only reason that the water is not boiling here is because it's under tremendous pressure from all the miles of water above it, to way out here, even off of the screen, where it's like 2 degrees Celsius, way out there. So extreme gradient in temperature from superheated to very, very, very cold. All right. That leads to species that live here tending to be specialists in the different regions. You'll have some that are right near the mouth of the vent, some that are a little further away, another group of organisms, another species further away, and then further away. Okay, and they're all adapted to those different temperatures and the other different parameters. The pH is going to vary depending on the type of the vent. The black smokers, the ones that you see on the right, tend to release hydrogen sulfide. They tend to be sulfurous. They tend to release sulfuric acid even, and they're going to have a low pH and be acidic, while the white smokers, like you see over on the left, are alkaline. Okay, they're going to be basic. The different vent ecosystems that we know of are represented on this map. And again, you notice that they're along plate boundaries. The black lines here are the plate boundaries, and you see the red and yellow dots on those plate boundary lines for the most part. There's a few exceptions to that, but the vast majority of them are along plate boundaries. And most of the rest of them are along hotspots. All right, chemosynthetic bacteria are the base of the food chain. We're going to have very short, simple food chains. Net primary productivity is quite low because chemosynthesis is not as productive as photosynthesis, and that keeps, along with other things, the food chains pretty short. This food web is pretty small compared to most marine food webs. The species richness is also low, but that's going to be in terms of number of species. But the species that are there are going to be found nowhere else. And in fact, the species that occur at one group of vents or even one vent might be completely distinct from species that occur at other vents or other groups of vents that are miles away. And that's because you have the open ocean in between. And an organism that has adapted to live at 100 degrees Celsius water is going to stay near its vent, and it's not going to be able to move through that 2 degrees Celsius deep water to the next vent to colonize it. So you tend to have these vents, a lot of them, each with their own unique endemic species, And a lot of these are unknown species. We don't know a lot about these vents because it's very expensive to send remote operated vehicles down to this area and catalog all these organisms that are down there. There's a lot of unknowns, but they tend to have very unique species and high proportions of endemics, even compared to like other vents. They tend to have their own endemics. So here's a diagram showing how it works. Where we're at is a mid-oceanic ridge, and for this one, a divergent plate boundary. We have the basalt crust, the oceanic crust, and because we're right at that mid-oceanic ridge, the oceanic crust is a little bit thinner in this section, and it's allowing the heat, the hot rock in the mantle to be a little bit closer to the ocean, a little bit higher up, and this pathway is created that allows for the hydrothermal fluids to come through. They escape carrying all of the minerals and heat with them and go out into the greater ocean. Chemosynthetic bacteria that live right near the vent mouth can do chemosynthesis with this, turn hydrogen sulfide into, or use hydrogen sulfide or iron 2 sulfide or whatever they're using as a source of energy. They can use that in place of photosynthesis, take carbon from the water as well, and make organic molecules, and then they can be the base of the food chain for all the other organisms, the tube worms, the woolly crabs, all of those things, or yeti crabs, I think they're called. There's very few ecosystem services. They don't provide a lot for humans because we don't go down there, but they do regulate ocean chemistry. They do provide a source of minerals in the ocean that comes from the mantle. And interestingly, they're the possible evolutionary origin areas for life, about 4.2 or even pushing that back to 4.3, 4.4 billion years ago. There is also the potential to mine for minerals down there. If you have this vent releasing a lot of minerals into the ocean, a lot of them are precipitating out right next to the vent, which builds that vent up and forms those chimneys. You can mine those. Oops, sorry, looks like I'm getting a spam call. Also some carbon cycling, but not a lot. It's negligible. Don't worry about it. So right now, I'm not aware of anybody mining hydrothermal vents yet, but they're definitely thinking about it. There's definitely the potential for mining sulfides, for mining gold, for mining other like rare earth minerals that are down in the vents. We also have other places in the deep ocean that we haven't talked about where people are thinking about mining. So these nodule deposits are not what we're talking about with hydrothermal vents, but they're interesting. We'll talk about them probably second semester. We may not talk about them. But people are thinking about mining the deep ocean. I think right now it's just not cost effective, but I think that we're getting right to that cusp of where people are seriously starting to invest into it. And, who knows what we're going to do to hydrothermal vents. But that's really the main threat. So right now, not happening as far as I know, but potentially will. All right, let's get to one of the big guys for the class, and that's coral reefs. So coral reefs, the ones that you tend to picture, the ones that I have pictured here on the right, those are found in tropical and subtropical shallow, warm waters. Not hot. We'll talk about the problem if that water gets too hot. Typically tend to be very clear water, very low turbidity, very high dissolved oxygen. We aren't really going to talk much about deep water corals throughout the rest of the class, but um, cold water corals, deep water corals do exist. They tend to not be photosynthetic, but they do exist. We're not going to talk about them too much, but those are not the guys that we're not that we're talking about here. We're talking about the tropical coral reefs and subtropical. These reefs are formed by the corals. So when we get to foundation species in about a couple weeks, these are an example of foundation species. One of the highest net primary productivity of all biomes. It's comparable to tropical rainforests and how productive it is. And coral reefs, importantly, provide habitat for a quarter, 25% of all the world marine species. All the world's oceanic species, 25% of them depend on the corals for at least one stage of their life cycle. Now that could be that a sea turtle just comes in and nibbles some algae off of the corals, gets cleaned by some cleaning fish, and then is on its way. It could be that fish go to the coral reef to lay their eggs. Those eggs hatch among the reef, and then the little young fish hide among the corals. until they reach their juvenile or adult stages and then they go out into the open ocean. Or it could be like a reef fish or a sea anemone lives its entire lives on the coral reef. And when I say nurseries, the nursery is what I meant when I said that those young baby fish are hiding in the corals. That's a fish nursery, a place where young fish live and then they go somewhere else as an adult. So if we're going to talk a lot about corals, let's talk about what a coral is. A coral is a mutualistic symbiotic relationship between a coral animal, the polyp, and an algae. And those algae are zooxanthellae algae. Not a term that you should know or be able to spell, probably, but one that you should be familiar with. You won't see it too often, really. The polyp is the animal. It filters food from the seawater. It provides nutrients. It will provide proteins to the algae. It also is what constructs the calcium carbonate exoskeleton. So the coral structure is created by these polyps. Each individual polyp on a coral is an individual organism, but they form these colonies on that we call corals. The algae, these are the photosynthesizers. You see them inside of the polyp cells right here. So they're literally inside the cells of the animal, and they're providing carbohydrates for the polyp. Okay, neither of them can live without the other, and that'll become important when we talk about coral bleaching. Coral reefs are found, or at least the tropical and subtropical reefs that we're talking about, are found only in the tropics, only in the shallow waters. You see that there is a very high concentration in the Eastern Pacific. There's a high concentration in the Caribbean, as well as the Red Sea. So those are some of the major areas where we have coral reefs. You also see a large strip around the Hawaiian Islands, including all the old Hawaiian islands that have eroded below the sea level, as well as the islands of Mauritius off the coast of India. The ecosystem services of reefs include fishing, tourism is huge, cultural services. Um, in terms of fishing, like among the world's oceans, like all the ocean, the open ocean, the reefs, etc., the intertidal zone, about 1.5 billion people worldwide rely on the ocean as their main source of protein. That could be fish or shellfish, but their main source of protein is coming from the ocean. So that's very, very, very important. Biodiversity, nutrient cycling, coastline protection. We'll talk about this in the context of mangrove forests, but the exact same principle that we see with the mangroves later on will apply here. They create and they stabilize and they even build shoreline. Coral reefs are valued anywhere between 30 billion and 375 billion dollars per year. So they provide lots and lots and lots of services for us, including being a massive carbon sink. So the calcium carbonate exoskeletons of corals, um, those store carbon. Those store carbon for geologically significant periods of times. So one way to combat climate change is actually to use corals and expand corals and to restore coral reefs where they have degraded and allow those corals to draw down carbon dioxide, create those photosynthates, and to create their calcium carbonate exoskeletons from the carbonate ions in the ocean, which ultimately come from the atmosphere from CO2, as we talked about when we were talking about the carbon cycle. Getting to some human impacts of coral reefs. One of those impacts is invasive species, something like lionfish that are in reefs off of Florida. Lionfish are native to Southeast Asia or the waters off of Southeast Asia. They're not native to the Caribbean or Florida, but they've been introduced by people and they're poisonous. They don't have any natural predators in Florida waters, and they increase in population size like exponentially uncontrolled, and they eat just about anything that they can get inside their mouths. And their mouths are pretty big. Another one is a pathogen, stony coral tissue loss disease. And you can see how this coral over just a month has has died due to stony coral tissue loss disease. So as that gets spread around the world through human activities, it's impacting coral reefs. We can overharvest a predator from the food chain, and that can stop that top-down regulation of organisms. We can remove those keystone species like sharks, and that can have a negative impact on the reef. If we remove, let's say, a great Triton, which is this sea snail down here, all the ones in the background that you see in this picture, they eat an organism called the crown of thorns starfish. The crown of thorns starfish in the Great Barrier Reef eats the corals of the Great Barrier Reef. People like these seashells of the Great Triton, so they overharvested the Great Triton because of the conch shells that they have. They're pretty shells, big deal. You can sit them on a mantelpiece or whatever. I don't know what people do with them. But if you remove this Great Triton, the crown of thorns starfish population increases, which decreases the amount of corals. They overgraze the corals. So if you want to explore this a little bit further, I have a couple videos linked here. I can put them in the description for you to check out. They're pretty interesting. Another major impact on coral reefs is fishing or overfishing. And I have a bunch of sub-bullet points for that. But fishing itself can disrupt nurseries. If we fish in an area where young fish are and we don't allow those fish to reproduce, and you take those fish out of that population, you're going to have a smaller reproductive population, and then the next generation is going to be smaller. Okay. Um, Overharvesting of adult fish, especially during spawning season or even just before spawning season, if you overharvest the adult fish before they can reproduce, then you're going to have a smaller next generation. And then there's some just really destructive fishing methods. Those can include things that are super common, like nets, including beach signs, which you're seeing over here on the right. These two people are doing it. But any type of net, any type of trap, and like this lobster trap, any type of anchor or line can all break or abrade corals. So they can just scratch corals up, they can sand them down smooth, and they can just break them and destroy them. Muroami is a fishing technique where people used to, largely outlawed, but used to cast a net off of the side of the boat, drop stones down onto the net to scare all the fish out of the corals, and that net that was on the corals is drugged up. And what's going to happen is that the stones are going to break the corals, and the net is going to braid the corals, and you're just going to have a lot of damage to the corals. Dynamite fishing obviously can be very damaging. Um, you just throw dynamite off the side of the boat, the explosion shocks fish. They all come up to the surface, kind of passed out, sedentary, or dead, and then you just scoop them up with a net. And then bottom trawling, which I'll show on the next slide, that will destroy deep sea and cold water corals, which I said we wouldn't focus on, but it is applicable for this. And then harvesting aquarium fish. What you're seeing on the bottom right is a guy spraying sodium cyanide. Sorry about the bell, spraying sodium cyanide to knock out fish so that he can easily pick out the ones that he wants to capture, put in a bag, and sell on the pet trade. The other fish that are knocked out are just left to die. Okay, once they're knocked out, most mini fish have to, contract their muscles and move and everything in order to pass water across their gills to get dissolved oxygen. And if they're passed out, those kind of muscle functions stop and they can't get the dissolved oxygen that they need, and they asphyxiate to death. They die. So bottom trawling, essentially what you're doing, this is not looking at normal coral reefs like we've been talking about, tropical and subtropical reefs. This is looking at those deep water corals that I said that we wouldn't mention too much, but here we are. And essentially what you do is you have a giant net, and these nets can be extremely large. Like you can fit multiple jumbo jets inside of one of these nets. They can be larger than football fields, larger than football stadiums. You weight those nets down and you have rollers on the bottom, and those rollers just roll on the bottom and you get anything in their path, and they crush anything in their path. So you might be fishing for some type of fish or for shrimp or for anything like that, but you're destroying corals while you're doing it, or at least the deep water corals. So a bit of a summary of that in this diagram, and some new information. I encourage you to pause this now and look through this diagram, but it includes everything from fishing nurseries to marine debris, so trash, indiscriminate fishing. We'll talk about bycatch later on, fishing where um, fish are breeding, and fishing too many big fish. Some other impacts of on the reefs. Pollution. Runoff can carry pollutants downstream towards the oceans. You can have an algal bloom and eutrophication on a reef, and that lack of dissolved oxygen that results from that algae bloom, the decomposers that decompose the algae specifically, can devastate the reefs because they need oxygen. It could also be that those algae just coat the corals. There's so many of them that they block light for photosynthesis, etc. Local pollutants. So, for example, we'll see a video later on in the school year where we see a sewage pipe in Florida literally just pumping raw sewage right near some corals. Okay, but that could be pesticides, herbicides, fertilizers, anything that's coming from the local area, just offshore or just onshore, rather. Sunscreen is another big one. You might not think that just a little bit of sunscreen on you could be an issue, but when there is 10,000 people that go to the same resort town every single summer, that's a lot of sunscreen that can go off into the water. And some of the chemicals in sunscreen have been leaked to coral bleaching, um, including oxybenzone, which is probably the most famous one, but also octinoxate. Some countries, and in the case of Hawaii, US states, are banning sunscreen that contain some of these chemicals. So I would always encourage you to get reef safe sunscreen if you're going to the ocean and using sunscreen, even if it's not near a reef, because some of these are long-lived chemicals that can move throughout the ocean's waters. So I just mentioned bleaching. What is bleaching? Well, bleaching is when the corals are stressed, either from heat, so I'm going to say high temperatures, and again, my mouse is not working super well, but high temperatures, or certain pollutants like that oxybenzone. Um, Essentially, what's happening is that the corals become stressed, they expel their photosynthetic algae, and they can't live without their algae. The algae can't live without them, and they die. So when the corals bleach, they turn bone white, which is why it's called bleaching. And like I said, the coral will die after it bleaches if it doesn't recover that algae within a short period of time. So over on the diagram on the left, we have a healthy coral. We have it becoming stressed. If it's stressed, it loses that symbiotic algae. So the algae is leaving those coral cells. The polyp is losing its zooxanthellae algae. And that polyp is left bone white because the algae is what gives the corals all their wonderful colors of the purples and yellows and reds and pinks and all of that. That's all from the algae. If the algae leaves, the coral is left with just calcium carbonate, bone limestone white. That stress, sorry again for the bell. I should edit that out, but I'm definitely not going to. That stress can be changed from ocean temperature, specifically an increase in temperature is what we're seeing today. Runoff and pollution, overexposure to sunlight, and extremely low tides. And these two kind of coupled together also influence the temperature. But the big guy here is the temperature increase. Okay. After a while, those corals can get covered with the slimy brown-green algae that is kind of like the gross algae. Those are not the good algae that we're wanting. That's not the zooxanthellae algae. Those are just like the everyday like pond scum looking algae. I shouldn't diss on algae. Algae are wonderful, but we don't want our corals getting covered in, we don't want our corals dying, and then we don't want them getting like covered by algae. We want them recovering. So you might go to an area. My point of saying that is that you might go to an area and you might see a whole bunch of corals and you might see that they're green, but that's just because they're getting coated by these algae that are just using them as a surface to live. It's not the living coral that you're seeing. So I mentioned that it's due to that coral bleaching is primarily due to increasing ocean temperatures, and that is what we're seeing in these two graphs. Over on the left, we have the global average ocean temperature, and we are seeing that it is increasing. The baseline, this dotted line is the 2000 to 2009 average. So if you average all of these years together, they're hovering right around that baseline. This isn't even showing compared to like a 1950 and 1980 average or a pre-industrial, but we can see that we are seeing accelerated increase of oceanic temperatures, both around the world and in the tropics, or sorry, the temperate regions, which is on the right. And here's some videos that I will link in the description talking about coral bleaching and ways to prevent bleaching and save the coral reefs. We will watch at least one of these in class, definitely one of them, probably two. Okay, so continuing with the human impacts on reefs, increased temperatures, I cannot stress enough, are what is linked to coral bleaching. There is a there is another impact that corals have, or rather two impacts that corals have with rising CO2 levels in the atmosphere. One is the increasing temperature of the ocean, like we said, but there is two other ones. One is that the sea levels are rising and corals are stationary, corals are sedentary, and they live for quite a long time. And it takes a long time for them to shift their range up and down based off of rising sea levels. And sea level is projected to increase faster than the corals can move. So if that happens, they might be left too low in the water column and with not enough light to sustain them because they're photosynthetic. So that's our second big impact. And then the third big impact we have already talked about, which is ocean acidification. And again, this is due to rising CO2 levels in the atmosphere. As more CO2 dissolves into the atmosphere, it reacts with water to create carbonic acid, which is decreasing the pH of the ocean and increasing the amount of hydrogen ions in the ocean. Those hydrogen ions react with and dissolve the coral structure, the calcium carbonate exoskeletons, as well as those calcium carbonate shells and exoskeletons of a whole host of other marine organisms, including phytoplankton and mollusks. This results in weak, thin, or absent exoskeletons on the shells, and it will kill the corals. A 2007 report, so that's 20 years ago, but a 2007 report for the University of Queensland, Australia, stated that reef erosion will exceed calcification, meaning that the rate at which the corals dissolve away will be faster than the rate at which they form their calcium carbonate exoskeletons at 450 parts per million. We're at 430 right now in August of 2025. So that's huge. That's impending, right? We're expected to hit 450 parts per million CO2 in the atmosphere by mid-century. So that is definitely going to devastate coral reefs, along with the bleaching and rising sea levels. So if you missed it when we talked about the carbon cycle, here's the chemistry that is involved. Atmospheric carbon dioxide dissolves into the ocean where it reacts with water to form carbonic acid. Note the strength of these arrows. Okay, the forward reaction is stronger than the reverse. That carbonic acid dissociates into bicarbonate ions and hydrogen ions. The hydrogen ions are the measure of acidity. That's what we're measuring when we talk about pH and when we talk about acidity. The more hydrogen ions, the lower the pH and the greater the acidity. Bicarbonate ions are useless for marine organisms. They can't make anything with bicarbonate ions. What they need is carbonate ions. Carbonate ions will prefer to bind with hydrogen ions to create more bicarbonate. So the more hydrogen ions we have in the ocean, the more this reaction is occurring. I'll remove all my boxes and notes to make it cleaner. But the more this reaction is occurring to make these bicarbonate ions, like we talked about with the carbon cycle. And notice the strength of these arrows, the relative strengths of them. The less calcium is going to bind with carbonate organically or inorganically to make organically the shells and exoskeletons of marine organisms, inorganically to make inorganic limestone in the ocean. So the higher the pH, the more calcium carbonate we're going to make, but the lower the pH, the more we acidify the oceans, the more bicarbonate we're going to make. And that is an issue because marine organisms cannot use bicarbonate. Moving on to the stuff on the left, the oceans have absorbed about a quarter of the carbon dioxide that we have emitted over the course of the industrial age. And remember that the pH scale is logarithmic, so just decreasing from 8.3 to 8.1 is a decrease of 30% in acidity, or 30% pH, which is an increase in acidity by 30%. And we can see the effect of the acidity on this marine butterfly or water butterfly, whatever it's called, this mollusk over here is it is literally dissolving in ocean water that is projected by 2100, the pH of ocean water by 2100. All right, so real quick, give this AP practice question a shot. Pause the video here and answer this. And when we get to the answer is C, a change in slightly basic toward a pH of neutral. A change from slightly basic towards pH neutral, that's what's happening. So we are, before the Industrial Revolution, way up here at around 8.3 for the pH on average around the ocean. We are now around 8.1. We are getting closer to neutral, which is way down here, even like further down here in this diagram. So we're not going to be breaching neutral anytime soon. We're not going to be getting lower than 7 anytime soon, at least not by 2100 within our lifetimes, but we are getting closer to neutral, which is what C is showing. Okay. Again, what organisms are going to be affected? They're the ones that form calcium carbonate shells or exoskeletons. Those include the exoskeletons of corals, like why we're talking about it here. The exoskeletons or shells of phytoplankton, that includes, I should really edit this out. The ones that I want you guys to know are not necessarily diatoms because most of them form silicate shells, meaning that they're made out of essentially glass. But coccolithophores, foraminifera, those are the ones that we talked about earlier on in the school year. The shells of mollusks, the skeletons and other marine, the skeletons of other marine species like starfish, and then the accelerometers and the heads of squid. A lot of different organisms are going to be affected by this. This is also the decrease in pH of the ocean is also affecting fish, right? Every organism is adapted for a specific range of environmental conditions, and if you drop the pH on many organisms, they're going to negatively respond to that, right? If you drop the pH of human blood, that's going to be an issue. If you drop the pH of the water that fish are passing along their gills, and that's going to be an issue. And if that wasn't enough, some other impacts on coral reefs, diseases like we talked about with stony coral tissue disease, recreation. So like this person on the right here is standing on this bit of coral, and you can see how smooth this coral has worn away by the generations of tourists coming to this area and standing on that coral. Dredging pretty much affects any marine biome where we can get to the benthos. Coral mining. So some island nations will use corals as their source of calcium carbonate to make cement, or just to build things like seawalls. It might be way more expensive for an island nation to import cement or import calcium carbonate or import stone than it is for them to just mine it right offshore, and it might be cheaper for them to mine the reef. So that's an issue, largely outlawed in many island nations, but still an issue. Boats and ships, so we can clear coral to make docks, and they can get damaged by propellers, by the hull, or by the anchors from ships. And then building directly on coral reefs and constructing seawalls directly on coral reefs happens, and that's a threat as well. All right, moving on from coral reefs to coastal wetlands. These are wetlands that form along the coast, so they're influenced by the saltwater of the coast. They might be partially submerged during high tide. They might have that salt water being inundated via the groundwater. Or it might be salt water that comes in during a storm surge only once in a while. But they're wetlands that are along the coast that are influenced by the salt water. Typically brackish water in the wetland where you have a mix of fresh and salt water. So it's a salinity of like 2%, 1.5%, something like that that's in between fresh and salt water. Typically going to be flat land with saturated soil, usually standing or very slowly moving water. And you see some examples of that in these pictures, where up here, this picture that I took in Alaska, you have a coastal wetland in this entire region that is not the mouth of the river. that's the estuary that we'll talk about soon, but all of this over here, coastal wetland, where you have brackish water and seagrasses, or sedges rather, in this area. Could be a salt marsh, could be a forested swamp, could be a seagrass meadow or a mangrove forest. We have different types of coastal wetlands, like I just mentioned, and here is a map showing some of those coastal wetlands worldwide. A relatively rare biome, okay, because they have to have relatively flat land that's saturated with soil where there's plants growing, and it has to be right along the coast. So relatively rare, but kind of common. Coastal wetlands have very high net primary productivity, especially the tropical ones. They are going to lag only behind coral reefs and tropical rainforests. Um, they have very high biodiversity. You have lots and lots of marine species coming from the ocean. Um, a lot of shorebirds, a lot of wetland birds, migratory birds that come to coastal wetlands. Lots of mammals, from deer to jaguar to pigs and wolves, will be in coastal wetlands. It is a very much increasingly rare biome because we tend to drain coastal wetlands for agriculture, development, or if it's one of the forested ones, clear them for timber. And then rivers and streams that feed these coastal wetlands can be dammed for a variety of reasons or diverted for irrigation. Some ecosystem services include habitat. Again, lots and lots and lots of birds in coastal wetlands, but many other organisms, from reptiles like saltwater crocodiles, alligators, to mammals. And lots of fish. They clean the water before entering the ocean, so they remove some excess nutrients. We have lots and lots and lots of plants, all those grasses in the marsh or sedges, all of those trees in the swamp that are going to be using all the nutrients before they get to the ocean and causing a eutrophication event. They buffer storm surges and tsunamis in the same way that coral reefs and, as we show it later, mangrove forests will. And they recharge coastal aquifers with fresh water, and you can have hunting and fishing, that food procurement in coastal wetlands. In fact, coastal wetlands were heavily used by people during Paleolithic times, before agriculture, because they were so biodiverse and so rich with living organisms. However, coastal wetlands are a very much threatened landscape. They are often drained for all those reasons that I discussed before. Um, like, if you could have an area that is a wetland that is not really being directly used for human activity except for hunting and fishing, um, and you could have a farmland on top of it, people have decided to go for the farmland. So if we look at this map, which is relatively small, I don't know if I zoom in, it doesn't look like that's going to work. But this map that's relatively small, we can see that Europe has lost most of its wetlands. That includes the coastal wetlands, but it also includes the inland wetlands, the freshwater wetlands that we'll talk about. But a notable example is England and Ireland. Um, they have lost around 90 to 95 or more percent of their coastal wetlands, because of drainage and because of channelization. Basically, to drain a wetland, all you have to do is dig one channel through the wetland. This is very much simplifying things, but dig a channel or a series of channels through the wetland, allow that water to drain out to the ocean as quickly as possible, and you can leave the high areas dry, and then you can do agriculture on them. The wetlands around the Thames River, for example, have pretty much most of them have been drained throughout the course of British history. Okay. We have pollution coming from upstream, and that can concentrate in the wetlands, and rising sea levels can submerge some coastal wetlands because they are flat areas right along the coast. And several of those impacts are what we're seeing in the bottom right picture with the coastal wetland loss around Louisiana. Mangrove forests are one special type of coastal wetland. They are either going to be in brackish or saltwater. These mangroves are super, super, super cool trees. They're the only trees in the world that are adapted to grow in like saltwater. So you will often see mangroves all the way up the river mouth, where it's mostly freshwater, maybe a little brackish water, but freshwater. And then right at the mouth of the river, where it's brackish, like 2% salt or varying salinity with the tides, and they'll totally be fine there. And then all along the coast of the ocean. And in fact, I've been in areas where it's just like mangrove islands, and there's nothing but just mangrove forests around the island, and there's no river, and there's no fresh water at all, and they're just growing in straight salt water. They're really, really, really cool trees. They're also very cool because they have this very interesting tangle of roots that allow them to anchor themselves in the ocean and resist storm surges, tides, tsunamis, even, um, and just the erosion of the sediment in the ocean water as the waves come in. That tangled massive roots allows them to get oxygen in the roots during low tide and often cases during high tide because those roots will prop them up above the high tide line in some cases. They're very extreme ecosystems in terms of salinity for plants, for trees specifically, but they're very, very, very biodiverse ecosystems and one of the most productive ecosystems on the planet. They're a very large carbon sink because of the biomass and because of the living tissue is a large carbon sink, but more so the sediment underneath that living tissue, the sediment that they're rooted in is very high in carbon as well. Um, think about all the dead leaves falling off of all these trees, going into the sediment around and below those roots, and getting locked in and held by those roots. And some of that organic matter decomposing, but a lot of it just getting buried by sands and silts and more organic sediment. And that carbon in those organic molecules will get trapped in that sediment really quickly and really easily and really effectively. So mangrove forests are one of the most effective types of forests to be creating or to be revegetating or restoring to combat global warming and global climate change because they're a huge carbon sink. The mangroves are a foundation species in the same way that the that the corals are a foundation species in the reef. And we'll talk about what that means a little bit later on. But when we talk about it, I'll use mangroves as an example. Mangrove forests grow along the coastlines throughout the tropics and subtropics, but even if it's shown pretty much everywhere in the tropics and subtropics, they're not ubiquitous and they're not like on every single coast, but they're very common along coastlines through the tropics and subtropics. Mangrove forests provide a lot of ecosystem services. In fact, they provide around an estimated $2.5 trillion of ecosystem services every year. That's more than coral reefs. All right. Habitat and biodiversity, nutrient cycling, water purification, again, just like the coastal wetlands, of which these are a type, they get a lot of nutrients from the estuary, from the river, and prevent those nutrients from going into the ocean where they could form an algal bloom. The trees will use those nutrients instead. Massive carbon sink that cannot be understated. Soil and sediment regulation, they are actually one of those few things that along the coast that can build up soil and build up the coast. They hold all of that sediment together with their roots and they prevent it from eroding away via the wave action of the ocean. So one of those few things along with coral reefs, seagrass meadows, and coastal wetlands that can build up and extend the shoreline rather than have it erode away. Timber, including firewood and charcoal, or for construction, but you can see the way that these trees don't grow very straight. They're not great for construction. Um, they will protect coastal communities from storm surges. They will mitigate runoff and erosion, and they protect from severe weather, including hurricanes and floods, but really storm surges and tsunamis and the storm surge that comes with the hurricanes and the tropical storms and all that. Cultural services as well as provisioning services, food specifically. So this diagram shows how both coral reefs and mangrove forests are going to protect coastal communities from storm surges, from tsunamis, one or the other or both. Coral reefs and mangrove forests will both break up the energy of those waves. They will prevent those waves from completing that full large circle that we talked about with the tsunamis in the case of coral reefs, and they will lessen the height of the waves. And then the mangrove forest will distribute that energy, will act as a buffer to reduce the energy of the waves before they get to the shore. So I'm going to show that in this video that's linked down here. I'll also put it in the description, and we'll hope that it works on the next slide. So I don't know if you can hear me over the people or if this is actually recording or not, but you can see the waves in this wave tank, all of the trees, the plastic trees replicate mangroves, and how still the water is on the other side. Let's rewind it, play it again, how large these waves are down here. They hit these trees, the mangroves, the roots, the leaves, the branches, the trunks of the trees, and massively slows down those waves and reduces the waves. Now, if you can imagine that this is a hurricane out in the Atlantic, maybe in the Caribbean, and you have a bunch of mangroves between the ocean and a coastal community, you can imagine how those mangroves can protect that coastal community. Threats for the mangrove forests include deforestation. That is primarily going to be for fuel wood because we are talking about the tropics and subtropics. We're talking about developing nations. And remember that over a billion people or around a billion people worldwide don't have reliable access to electricity. If their local source of cooking wood, of wood to make fires to cook their food, is the mangrove forest, well, you're going to have an entire community using that mangrove forest every single day, which can lead to deforestation of those mangroves. Charcoal production and shrimp aquaculture are actually the largest drivers of this. The charcoal is coming from the trees. You use wood to make charcoal if you didn't know. And then people want to be able to get to an area in order to do their shrimp aquaculture, remove all the mangroves. You can do all the shrimp aquaculture in that area. Dredging, kind of rinse and repeat for dredging, pollution, overfishing, and introduced species. About a third or over a third of the world's mangrove forests have been lost since the 1980s, and since 2000, the deforestation of mangrove forests has contributed to an estimated 447 million tons of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, so 500 million tons of CO2. If we are to revegetate these, however, we can lock in that CO2. And where those mangroves are threatened, you can see on the map where they are critically endangered, like in the southern United States or in Sri Lanka and the tip of India and Mauritius, where they are endangered, as well as where they're vulnerable or where they're actually doing quite well. Okay, so moving a little bit away from the oceans into the terrestrial aquatic systems, we're going to be looking at those that are not in the ocean but on land. And the first one is still sticking with that saline theme, salt lakes. These form in three ways. It could be an inland drainage basin, so like Lake Chad or the Great Salt Lake are formed as the local rivers don't drain out to the ocean, they just funnel down into a basin, into like a bowl in the middle of the continent and fill up that bowl. Okay. It could be an isolated section of ocean that is isolated when sea levels fall. Um, or it could be due to really dumb human activity, which is like what the Salton Sea is from. But most of them are from inland drainage basins. The salt concentration can be around the same salinity of the ocean, or it could be way, way, way saltier than the ocean is. Okay, so they can be extremely salty environments. Temperature is going to vary based off of the latitude and the depth of those lakes. At the same latitude, a deep lake will be cooler than a shallow lake. Okay. Depth, turbidity, all of those things are going to vary. Um, because of the high salinity, there does tend to be low dissolved oxygen, but there is high mineral content, which may include nutrients. So like the Great Salt Lake has lots and lots and lots of phosphates. You can mine phosphates in the areas where it's dried up, for example. Usually basic pH. Don't worry about most of those abiotic characteristics, but just know that it's really, really, really salty. Because of the high salinity, there's very low net primary productivity. Really, there's no plants. No plants will survive in most salt lakes. What you have instead are these red algae that'll grow, and then those algae will be eaten by brine shrimp, which will be eaten by flamingos, for example. You have very simple, short food chains and food webs. So this is a pretty realistic food web for a salt lake, and like I said, very short, very Very simple. This is nowhere near the complexity of most food webs. Very low net primary productivity, very low species richness, and you do have some very unique species, but not a lot of species. Note the absence of fish. Fish can't tolerate most salt lakes, and the apex predators are birds. Any organism that is in these waters or feeding in these waters needs to be able to tolerate the salt. So they are known as halo, meaning salt, phials, meaning lovers. So they do very well in salt. Most have special pathways to secrete salt. Birds, for example, have special glands. Shorebirds have special glands in their face that will excrete salt through their nasal passages or through their mouth, but they can also migrate. So really, um, just know that they have to tolerate or be adapted to the high salinity. There aren't a ton of ecosystem services, but those that we do have include salt. You can literally just get like uh, like mine salt from the shores of many salt lakes where that salt forms a crust, or you can have get areas or pools of water that you section off and allow to evaporate and leaves behind the salt, and you can harvest salt. You can also mine other minerals. Like I said, people mine the salt flats around the Great Salt Lake where it has receded for phosphates and other nutrients or other minerals, rather. Biodiversity, a little bit. Waterfowl, you can have some hunting, habitat, stuff like that. Around the world, salt lakes are threatened with drainage. They are a diversion, or like the rivers that feed them are diverted for agriculture. That's especially happening in the Great Salt Lake. You can see from 1985 to 2022, we have had about a 60% decline in the surface area of the Great Salt Lake. And that is due to diversion of water of the three major rivers that feed the Great Salt Lake for agriculture, primarily growing hay or alfalfa to feed to cattle. All right. So if the farmers weren't taking as much water from the rivers that feed the Great Salt Lake, the Great Salt Lake would not be receding. Now, it might sound not a big deal if salt lakes recede because they don't perform many ecosystem services, but the ones that they do perform are pretty essential. And one thing that I didn't mention, I'll get to. One for the Great Salt Lake is that it's a very important stopping place for migratory birds as they move from their winter grounds in Mexico, southern United States, up to Canada and Alaska. The Great Salt Lake is a ideal stopping point for many birds throughout what is otherwise a very arid region of the United States. On the bottom of the Great Salt Lake, there are a lot of arsenic deposits. And if the Great Salt Lake were to completely dry up and then all of that sediment at the bottom of the lake was to be exposed to the air and dry out and then get blown up in the wind, you can have arsenic, cadmium, mercury, lead, all of these toxic metals that can get blown up in the dust and then move over to Salt Lake City and the surrounding area. All right, so it is really critical that the Great Salt Lake not completely recede. All right, let's move on to our freshwater ecosystems. We're talking about normal ponds and lakes here, freshwater ponds and lakes. These are sometimes called lentic ecosystems. Lentis means still, so we're talking about still water. You probably will never see that term in this class. We'll use the term ponds and lakes. They can be connected to rivers or they may be isolated from rivers. You might have a river go into a large basin that fills up a lake, and then you have the exit of that river on the other side of that lake, and the river just continues. Or it might just be an isolated kettle pond, for example, like in Minnesota, where it's just a isolated lake with no river or creek feeding into it or exiting from it. To differentiate between ponds and lakes, ponds are usually less than 5 hectares or 12 acres in area, so still can be relatively large, much bigger than the picture on the top right, and less than 5 meters deep, so shallow, and have less than 30% area covered by emergent vegetation, meaning this vegetation that emerges from the lake surface or the pond surface. So ponds are smaller than lakes, lakes are bigger. Okay. In this class, we're going to use the terms pretty much interchangeably because we're going to be talking about them as one unit, as a similar, like they function similarly as ecosystems. But when I say a lake, you know what a lake is. When I say a pond, you know what a pond is. All right. Ponds and lakes can be divided into life zones based off of the depth and the light. You can see that in the diagram on the bottom right. However, you don't really need to know that. You don't really need to, you won't be tested or quizzed on it. And I never see any AP questions about the limnetic zone or the littoral zone. They do exist, and if you're into ponds and lakes, like it's really cool. Check it out. Um, so yeah, what you do need to know is this natural process of eutrophication. Now, ponds age, lakes age, and it sounds kind of weird, but they go through these different stages as they age. The first stage, when a lake or a pond is first formed, let's say that we have a glacier that retreats off of like from the North American continent, um, 12,000 years ago, and it leaves behind a bunch of newly exposed ponds and lakes that are filled with glacial meltwater. Those are going to be oligotrophic ponds and lakes, very new ponds and lakes. They're going to have low nutrients, low dissolved oxygen, very clear water, and low producer population densities. You're going to have some primary productivity, but not as much as in these later stages. Mesotrophic ponds and lakes are kind of in the middle ground. So let's imagine that this pond has been in existence for a few thousand years. You have a few thousand years worth of sediment being delivered by rivers. You have a few thousand years worth of organic sediment in the form of dead leaves from the surrounding forests that have been blown into the pond during the autumn, and then they've settled down to the bottom. You have all of the many generations of plants in the water, whether those are the cattails or the sedges, the reeds, the lilies, the water lettuce that lives its life, dies, and then settles down to the bottom. You have all of the animal waste, all of that stuff going down and settling on the bottom and building up this sediment. A lot of that sediment is going to be organic in ponds and lakes, but some of it, especially if this is a river-fed system, is going to be inorganic. It's going to be silts and clays. Okay. Large carbon store at the bottom of many ponds and lakes because of all of that vegetative material, all that organic material that goes down, settles on the bottom, and doesn't decompose very slowly. Or sorry, doesn't decompose very quickly. It decomposes really slowly and builds up organic sediments. Eutrophic ponds and lakes are where we keep going with that system, right? It's another few thousand years later, and the rivers have dropped off even more sediment. There's more organic sediment from all the vegetation that surrounds and is in the pond and lake, and um, that pond and lake continues to fill up and continues to add more nutrients. The dissolved oxygen decreases even further. There's high producer population densities, meaning many, many, many plants in that ecosystem. And the low dissolved oxygen may kill off a lot of organisms that depend on the dissolved oxygen, like bass and trout. But other species like catfish that are adapted to low dissolved oxygen will survive just perfectly and they'll be totally happy. You have lots of birds, very productive ecosystem. Okay, that's the natural process. The natural process is that it takes thousands and thousands, millions of years to go from oligotrophic to mesotrophic to eutrophic. The problem is cultural eutrophication. This is where humans cause eutrophication, not in tens of thousands or millions of years, but in a day or 2 days or 5 days or a week or a month. Okay. The magnitude of change is the issue. And we've talked about cultural eutrophication before. You guys can read through this flowchart and review cultural eutrophication. Finally, the last stage is a wetland, and that's really what's pictured down here in the bottommost diagram, where you have very shallow standing water and plants covering that entire thing. All right, but just to give you another set of diagrams and some real life pictures, an oligotrophic lake, think a crystal clear lake, low primary productivity, not a lot of algae, not a lot of plants inside of that water. But over time, it turns to mesotrophic, where you have a lot more nutrients, less clarity, less dissolved oxygen, but way more productivity and therefore more fish, more birds, etc. That becomes eutrophic over time, again, thousands to millions of years, where it's got lots and lots and lots of nutrients. It's still healthy, but there's just a different cast of organisms that are there that are adapted to that low dissolved oxygen. And then eventually that will continue to fill in over time with both inorganic and organic sediments and create a wetland. Another process that occurs in many lakes, especially in the temperate regions, is turnover, the fall and the spring turnover. Okay, so what happens here? Well, in the summer, the lake is going to stratify based off of temperature. Don't worry about these terms, but you're going to have a layer on the top that is warm water that's sitting underneath the sun all day and it's getting warm. And as we know, if a fluid is warmer, it expands in volume, it's less dense, so it rises to the top. And if we have warm water at the top, it's just going to stay at the top until the fall. In the fall, we get the cooling of that area and those cold nights and everything, and the lake basically gets all the same temperature all throughout. In this case, on this diagram, 4 degrees Celsius. So the lake can literally mix, especially as it moves from fall into like later stages of fall, going towards winter, where the top layer might be 2 degrees Celsius on a cold late fall night, sink down to the bottom and allow that bottom, which is 4 degrees Celsius, to rise to the top. And that's going to bring nutrients with it. This is basically like an upwelling in the ocean where we're bringing nutrients up to the top. During the winter, again, temperate region, during the winter, the lake is covered in ice. That insulates the lake below, but we do get stratification of 2 degrees Celsius at the top and then 4 degrees Celsius at the bottom. So maybe a little bit of mixing, but not really until the spring where we get thawing of the ice. That cold ice water will sink and that, well, it'll sink as it's shown here like that. And then that'll allow the still cool but warmer deep water to rise and bring nutrients up with it. Okay, so stratification during the summer and winter, and then turnover in the spring and fall due to differences in temperature, and differences in temperature in a fluid mean differences in density. And as it turns over, it's just like an upwelling in the ocean, bringing nutrients from the bottom to the top of those waters. In tropics, though, we tend to not get any turnover. Those lakes tend to just stay stratified. Imagine that they just sit in this summer position the entire year. So some threats for ponds and lakes. For the ecosystem services, much is the same for those of rivers and streams. We'll talk about them on the next few slides. For lakes, the threats include drainage. So we will lose lakes to drain for agricultural water. We'll divert the rivers that feed them, especially for agriculture. Agriculture is the biggest use of water that humans use. But in a local area, it might be for industry, it might be for urban use, but it's usually for agriculture. Pollution and then the resulting, if it's, or pollution and if it's nutrient pollution like fertilizers, the resulting eutrophication, which is what you see in these two pictures here. These are both from Lake Erie, where you have massive algal blooms every single year because of the massive amount of nutrients that are used in the cities and, more importantly, around the countryside, the farmland around Lake Erie, leading to toxic algal blooms. Okay. They even put out in some years, like the city of like some of the cities around Lake Erie. I'm blanking on the city names. They've had like drinking water notices where you're supposed to boil the water because even though it goes through the water purification system, some algae still has gotten through. And then no swim notices for people because the eutrophication is so bad. And then obviously shoreline development. All right, so that last stage of pond and lake formation is wetlands. Now, not all wetlands have to come from an old pond or a lake. It just could be a wetland that is in like a flat area that is just got, saturated soil all the time. It doesn't have to be from an old pond or a lake that has gone through that entire process of eutrophication. but some of them are. Now, a wetland is a fully or semi-aquatic ecosystem where the soil is either submerged seasonally or it's consistently underwater. The depth can vary, but it's usually less than 2 meters deep. These ones that we're talking about here are freshwater, although we did talk about coastal wetlands earlier. The vegetation can be submerged, it can be totally emergent, like what we're seeing in the top right, or it could be floating, like what we see in the bottom. You might be able to see that these duckweeds are floating vegetation, or they could be hummocks. The hummock is the little rise of the little mound of dry land that these grasses are growing on, for example. They're often associated with rivers and streams, but they can be unassociated with any flowing body of water. They could be standing water, they could be slow moving water. Because it's either standing or slow moving water, that results in anaerobic soil. All of the pores in the soil that would otherwise hold air are filled up with water, and that air is kicked out, and there's no air in it, so it's anaerobic, meaning that um, any decomposition or any microbial activity that occurs in those soils is also going to be anaerobic. Most wetlands have plants that release some organic acids into the water, and that results in slightly acidic um, soils and waters. And it's also because of some fermentation byproducts that occur in those anaerobic soils. But anaerobic, acidic soils. Some of the highest net primary productivity of any biomes, especially tropical wetlands. Temperate wetlands, still very productive, but because tropical wetlands have year-round warm temperatures and consistent water, they're going to be very, very, very productive, among the most productive ecosystems. There are four main types of wetlands. A fen, we actually have quite a few fens in Colorado. These are characterized by moving groundwater, which will come up irregularly as springs and then disappear in that wetland. So like imagine that you have like Rocky Mountains, right? You guys go up into the mountains and there's like a little tiny valley, maybe like even looks like a ravine, and it looks like every once in a while you might see some flowing water, but not always. And most of it is just covered in thick grasses or sedges that look way more moist than the rest of the landscape, the higher or steeper terrains. What's going on is like you usually have a solid bedrock base, and the water that's flowing underground is not penetrating into that bedrock. So if I diagram it, let's say that we have bedrock, and then we have the soil surface, which I'm going to show in green, and the water is flowing along, like through the soil, downhill. Sorry, my mouse is not working with me today. Water is flowing downhill between the rock and the surface of the soil, coming up every once in a while as a spring and then going back down again as it saturates that soil. Fins are super cool in the Rockies. You can find them if you search around, and they're really cool. I'd recommend checking them out on a hike or something because like I really love fins. They're awesome. Very unique species compared to the surrounding landscape because they have consistently saturated water, or at least most of the season, saturated water. A marsh, these are characterized by slow moving or standing water, and it's dominated by emergence, so usually grasses, sedges, reeds, cattails, lilies, stuff like that. A bog or a peat bog is slow moving or standing surface water. All the rest of these, besides the fens, are slow moving, standing surface water. But a bog, also known as a peat bog, a mire, or a muskeg, if you're talking about the ones in the Arctic or in the boreal regions, um, they are dominated by mosses, and those mosses create peat-rich soils, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And they can also include some shrubs like heathers, including blueberries and cranberries, and the heath of the Scottish heathlands. Swamps, these are dominated by trees, so cypress, tupelo, stuff like that. All right, the ecosystem services for wetlands are huge and cannot be understated. They provide habitat and biodiversity. Nutrient cycling is huge. Wetlands, like with both water purification and water supply, they will clean the water that is going through, through them. Like if this is a river-fed wetland system, let's say that we have a river coming in that has lots of fertilizer runoff, lots of nutrients, lots of sediment. You reach this flat, still area with lots and lots and lots of vegetation where the water moves very slowly. It drops all the sediment and the sediment settles to the bottom. So for that reason, we get cleaner water coming out. All the nutrients get used by all the plants that are surrounding and in the wetlands, and they use up more nutrients than they will release through the decomposition of their biomass. And the water that comes out of the wetland is going to be cleaner, have less nutrients, less fertilizer runoff, for example, than the water that came into the wetland. So we tend to think about wetlands as nasty and stinky water, but it's actually cleaning that water as that water goes through the wetland. Okay, that is definitely not how wetland water usually is. It's usually pretty clean water. They're also a major carbon sink. Remember that these soils are acidic and anaerobic. That slows down decomposition. So any plants that die in the wetland tend to settle down to the bottom and form organic sediments that build up over time and store carbon. They don't decompose very easily. If those wetlands are in the far north, they tend to be underlain by permafrost, and that permafrost will just freeze all that carbon and totally prevent decomposition once it freezes. So wetlands can be a major carbon sink. So one way to combat climate change is to restore wetlands, especially those that we have degraded or drained. All right. Read through these other ones, but a lot of them are repeats. We talked just now about the soil stuff. We talked about the water stuff. Food is one of those services for every ecosystem. And then this section for the storm surges, that's really for the coastal wetlands. I have them here, but don't worry about it here. These are inland wetlands. They're for coastal wetlands. And every ecosystem has cultural benefits and cultural services. So getting back to that huge carbon reservoir that wetlands are, let's look at peat bogs because peat bogs are probably the largest of the carbon reservoirs of all the wetlands, or the largest carbon sink. And I'm going to read this quote to you, one of the few quotes that I'll ever read because I just really like this quote. But check out the pictures on the right. These are the sphagnum moss or the peat moss that she is talking about in this quote. So the mop top head of the sphagnum is the capitulum, the living part of the plant. So we're looking at this section right here, or you can see it from a distance over there. Below the surface, each stem, resembling twisted wire, extends down and down. The stem has two kinds of branches, those that spread out for support and those that dangle down to draw up water. The leaves have differing cells. The living green chlorophorus cells, which are interspersed between the larger dead hyaline cells, convert sunlight into energy. The dead cells, which are in the same leaf, which are the sphagnum's operative agent, each hold 20 times its weight in water. The underwater dead zone of the plant can exist for years, quietly accumulating mass, becoming more densely packed and compressed by the weight of the living plant above, the plants around it, and the weight of the water. As the moss top layer expands, its domain below the surface, its elderly parts senesce, packing it deeper, denser, century after century as it changes into peat. It can take 10,000 years for a bog to convert to peat, but in only a few weeks, a human on a peat cutter machine can strip a large area down to the primordial gravel. And I want you to look at what she is talking about here, that layer upon layer upon layer of generation after generation after generation of peat mosses, compressing further down, impurities getting squeezed out and turning darker. And remember that the darker the soil, the more carbon rich it is. And look at how dark that soil is. That is lots and lots and lots of carbon. In fact, that is the first stage of coal formation right there. And just like coal, we can dig it up and in this case let it dry and burn it. It burns just like wood, really, because it's basically just concentrated carbon. The a person on a peat cutter machine can just strip out a whole section of peat that takes thousands of years to form, like she said, in a day. All right. So this is a huge carbon sink, but it can be a carbon source when people dig it up and burn it. Or more often, what people are doing today burning it was more of like an antiquity. But today, what people are doing is digging it up and selling it as peat moss or sphagnum moss to the horticultural industry. So if you are trying to be sustainable in gardening, don't buy any soils that contain peat moss or sphagnum moss. Coconut coir is a much more sustainable method or much more sustainable product. Basically, what they do is they take coconut husks, and people are always eating coconuts. People have lots of waste coconut husk, and they shred them down, and they make the same type of material that you would use as for the sphagnum moss. But peat bogs, one of the largest carbon sinks in the planet. Okay, so keep those natural services in mind, how we can benefit from wetlands as we go through the human impacts that we're having on wetlands. One of the biggest ones is alterations to water flow. So disrupting the natural course of the water, the natural volume, the natural rate, etc. Disrupting water availability, which can harm those wetland plants. If they're not getting the amount, the frequency, or the rate of water that they are evolutionarily adapted to, then they're going to suffer. Okay. Drainage of the wetlands, this is very similar, but in terms of drainage, what you were doing is allowing an exit flow for all that water to get out. So you're probably digging ditches and digging artificial canals. And you are often going to add soil on top of those wetlands to rise them up a little bit. So you dig a canal through the wetland, and then you use that soil that you dug out of that canal to raise up the areas around it so that it doesn't the water table is a little bit lower. Okay. Um, Historically, that was used. Both of those are used for converting wetlands to agricultural land, and we see that here in Florida. Um, this area of Florida is a huge agricultural district. You can see all of the, you know, regular lines of the agricultural fields, and they grow everything there. A lot of sugarcane, at least historically, a lot of sugarcane, but also, um, anything else that would grow in a subtropical environment. So you have Lake Okeechobee, and Lake Okeechobee doesn't have an exit river that comes out. Instead, it slowly drains out all through here via many small inlets and into the sawgrass plains where the water table is super high. A lot of this drainage is just underground because the soil here is, or the rock here is limestone and it's very porous, and all of this water just slowly makes its way down through the sawgrass plains and through the Everglades. Okay. You also have areas right adjacent to it, like Big Cypress, that would also be where the water table would also be very high. So all of that would be mostly moving underground, a lot of it on the surface as well, just feeding all of this the Florida Everglades, which would stretch from Lake Okeechobee down to the coast. We identified this area, or humans identified this area as great agricultural land. They raised the land and they altered the flow of all that water coming out of Lake Okeechobee. You can see how Lake Okeechobee itself has been altered, right? All of this land right here is now dry that it wasn't before. And you have a very small portion of Everglades remaining in Everglades National Park, and then kind of mix match in this water conservation area, and then heavy agriculture all in this entire area, and extremely heavy development, Miami, right? Um, that has changed the ecology of the Everglades down here in Everglades National Park. Okay. Barriers to animal movement, so dams, habitat fragmentation, changes in water chemistry and quality. All of the agricultural runoff from this area is going somewhere, and it is following the natural course of that water and potentially getting into the Everglades. So pollutants, including pesticides and all of the urban runoff, could be, given Miami's infrastructure, it could be polluting the Everglades as well, the natural areas around it. And then pollution, we won't talk about pollution until second semester, so don't worry about that for right now. And then introduced species, we're going to talk about those in depth in a later PowerPoint, and we'll talk about a few that impact the Everglades themselves. Okay, but this is not just a Florida problem. This is just Florida is just the example that I had. All around the world, everywhere, people have been either draining or raising wetlands, primarily for agriculture and development. For example, the United Kingdom only has, about 10% of its remaining wetlands left. For example, London was a wetland. It is supposed to be on a wetland, but you won't see that anymore in London because they've just altered the land so much. Okay, so the UK only has about 10% of all of its wetlands left. All right, our next biome is rivers and streams. These are a freshwater aquatic biome where the water is flowing under the influence of gravity, and it flows in a channel, a more or less defined channel. Drains the land in the surrounding watershed. Rivers tend to be small, streams tend to be large. Other words for streams that you might know are brooks, creeks, etc. Um, you guys know that many tributaries are often associated with one larger river. So one large river will have many smaller tributaries. And we often divide rivers into upland rivers and lowland rivers. Upland rivers tend to be on hilly or mountainous terrain. They tend to be smaller waterways. They tend to be the tributaries of larger waterways, and they tend to have faster flowing water. Lowland rivers tend to be flat land closer to sea level. They tend to have larger waterways and slower flowing water and tend to have higher turbidity than upland rivers. Upland rivers also tend to have higher dissolved oxygen than lowland rivers as well. The abiotic characteristics of rivers and streams can vary widely. So, like for dissolved oxygen, for example, a fast flowing, very turbulent river is going to have more dissolved oxygen. Don't confuse turbulent with turbid or turbidity. Turbulent means that it's flowing very quickly. There's a lot of turbulent flow. So, it means that it's flowing very fast. Um, Among other things like eddies and all that flow. Don't worry about it. Um, but those rivers tend to have higher dissolved oxygen than very slow moving rivers like we see with the Mississippi down here below. The pH of rivers tends to hover around neutral, slightly acidic rivers, slightly basic rivers. It just depends. Temperature is going to vary widely based off a lot of reasons. Rivers tend to carry sediment and nutrients and deposit that sediment and nutrients from the upland systems, like the mountains, into lowland systems, floodplains, lakes, and estuaries. And the base of the food chain, the nutrients, are often coming from the terrestrial sources. So, like leaves from nearby trees, for example. So, like the photosynthesizers in the moving water, the nutrients that they're using is coming from the terrestrial surrounding sources. Often, the fish are going to be eating um, stuff from terrestrial sources as well, such as insects that fly from the land and like lay their eggs in the water, but then get eaten before they can lay their eggs, for example. Ecosystem services include drinking water and water for agriculture, for industry, and for any other use, fishing and other provisioning services, transportation, hydroelectric power, like we see a hydroelectric dam here on the bottom left, and cultural services. Many of the impacts that we have for rivers and streams are the same for our other freshwater aquatic systems because many of them are interconnected by rivers and streams. So alterations of flow like dams, dikes, levees, concrete channels like we talked about with the LA River, prevention of sediment from reaching the coastline or from reaching the estuary. That's going to cause the rate of the estuary to erode faster than being deposited or growing. We'll talk about that a little bit more in the following slides. Right now, less than 1% of rivers in the less than 1% of river miles in the United States are defined as free flowing, as in that flow is not affected by human structures. A lot of that is in the high mountains. So think about hiking in the Colorado Rockies and seeing those freely flowing small rivers and streams. That's what we're measuring here for the most part. Some of it's in like very remote regions, like in places of Alaska that are super remote. But most of the rivers, like the vast majority of the river miles in the United States, are affected by human activity. They're not free flowing as they once were. Diversion of water for irrigation. Some examples include Lake Chad, Tulare Lake, Great Salt Lake, but the one that I have over here is the Aral Sea on the border of Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan and Central Asia. And we can see the loss of the Aral Sea even since the 1970s or 1980s when these satellite images first were taken, or the first satellite images were taken. Pollution is another big one. As of 2022, 51%, over half of U.S. river miles, are considered too polluted to be safe for swimming or fishing, according to, sorry about the bell, according to the United States Environmental Protection Agency. That's disgraceful. Okay, that's really disgraceful for the country with the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. And then finally, where the river meets the sea is the estuary. Sometimes you'll see this called the delta, but slightly different definitions. Don't worry about it for this class. You can call it the delta for this class. This is where we deposit a lot of the sediment that the river has been carrying for miles and miles and miles and miles. That sediment you can see is building up these estuaries. So we can see the sediment here building up that coastline. We can see it right here in the form of these sandbars, and you can see it in these other two pictures as well. The reason that this is fan-shaped out towards the ocean is because of centuries, millennia of sediment deposition. Estuaries have very high nutrients because that sediment contains nutrients, and we therefore have very high net primary productivity and biodiversity. It's the most productive part of the river. Now that is obviously going to depend on the amount of nutrients in that river, the latitude that that river is in, and a tropical river tends to have a more productive estuary than a Arctic river, for example. Large rivers often move from one channel into a braided stream or intertwined channels like we see in the top right, or many separate channels like we see in the far right. And the water at the mouth of the river often becomes brackish in accordance with the tides. So as the tide, I'll use the one on the bottom right, I guess, or the far right. As the tide rises, salt water can go up into the mouth of the river. And then as the tide retreats, or as the tide falls, the power of the river is continuously moving fresh water down and is flushing out that salt water. So you can have variance in salinity and some brackish conditions existing in the estuary. More brackish closer to the ocean, less brackish further away from the ocean. However, because salt water is more dense than fresh water, where we tend to see that brackish water is lower down in what we call the saltwater wedge. So the saltwater wedge is going to extend further in at high tide and then get pushed out at low tide. One issue with that is the rising sea levels and the fact that many organisms, many plants especially, are not adapted to saline conditions. And as sea levels rise, more of the estuary and deeper into the river itself becomes saline. So one way to combat that is to block that saltwater wedge, literally just create a barrier to that saltwater wedge, whether that's made out of concrete or stone or whatever. You can create a barrier at the mouth of the river that will prevent that saltwater wedge from like going up into the river. Now that's not going to hold back that saltwater wedge forever, and with rising sea levels, it's a temporary solution. The real solution there is to combat global warming and global climate change, reduce CO2 emissions in the atmosphere, and stop the melting of the ice, or at least slow down the melting of the ice in the Arctic, Antarctic, and high mountains around the planet. But we do a lot of agriculture along rivers, and if even like right up near the coast, and if those rivers become saline and that water that we're irrigating our crops with becomes salty, then those crops are going to die. Some other issues include overfishing, drainage development, many of the same as we saw for rivers, and some of the oceanic biomes, especially those right along the coast, like the intertidal zone. So here's some pictures of some of those impacts. We see everything from coastal development to pollution to the drainage of rivers. So coastal development on the top right, pollution down here in the bottom right, as well as both of those in the picture in the center. And then Here we see the Colorado River Delta before and after all the drainage. Remember, 95% of the river just about is used before it reaches the delta. A lot of it's in dry years or when they were constructing Lake Mead and Lake Powell, no water reached the delta, and large portions of that delta have desertified, turned to desert. And then we also see some coastal developments that have been submerged by a storm surge. Possibly, I don't know the specifics about around this storm. Could be just a normal storm surge or a really strong hurricane or a tropical storm, or having sea level rise contributing to that rising water in that storm surge. Not really sure for that specific example, but regardless, we see houses flooded near the coast, probably in an area that looks similar to this right along the estuary. All right, that was a whole lot for what is going to look like very little or few learning objectives. But we got our freshwater biomes. We just need to know a lot about those freshwater biomes. And we got those marine biomes, those saltwater biomes. And again, we need to know those biomes and what's going on in those biomes. So it does take a lot and a lot of time to talk about all those. We're also going to see those human impacts again and again and again throughout the entire school year, so it's good to introduce them here. And then this one we definitely talked about as well, those abiotic factors. And we talked about the impacts that humans have on coral reefs and wetlands and mangroves. So kind of previewing some of that second semester content, moving that second semester content rather to first semester, just to front load some stuff. All right. I will see you all in class. I kept this under 2 hours, so yay. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.